The first thing I saw after returning from my deployment wasn't my house. It was a 12-foot concrete wall cutting straight across my front property line. For a moment, I thought I had the wrong address. Fresh landscaping surrounded the wall. Decorative lights had already been installed, and a brand new HOA sign proudly stood beside it, making it look as if it had always belonged there. The construction was so complete that anyone driving by would assume the land had never been mine. Then the HOA president walked over with a confident smile. "Welcome home," she said casually. "Since you were gone for so long, we believed this section was HOA common property. The project's already finished." I looked at the wall, then at the property markers barely visible beneath the new sod. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. Instead, I pulled out my phone. I photographed every inch of the wall, every survey marker they had tried to bury, every fresh concrete seam, and every contractor's sign still sitting near the entrance. Then I measured the distance from my original boundary pin to the wall and quietly saved every image. Finally, I looked back at the HOA president. "You might want to tell everyone not to touch another brick," I said. She laughed. She thought I was giving up. She had no idea that the wall standing on my land wasn't trapping me. It had just trapped the entire HOA. Most people in the neighborhood knew me only as the quiet military guy at the end of the street. I wasn't the kind of homeowner who attended every HOA meeting or argued about neighborhood politics. Between training assignments, deployments, and long periods away from home, I preferred to keep to myself. I paid my dues on time, maintained my property, and stayed out of everyone's business. The property itself had been in my family for years. After my father passed away, I inherited the land and eventually built a modest home on it. Before construction, I had paid for a professional survey and kept copies of every deed, permit, and property record. My father had always told me, land is one thing nobody can make more of. Protect every inch of it. Those words stayed with me. Unfortunately, the HOA president had a very different philosophy. Her name was Linda Harper, and she had spent years expanding the HOA's influence over the neighborhood. Most residents tolerated her because fighting the board usually meant months of letters, meetings, and legal threats. Linda loved rules, but only when they benefited her. A few months before my deployment, the HOA began discussing a beautification project near the neighborhood entrance. New signs, landscaping, decorative walls, and expanded common areas were all part of the proposal. At the time, I didn't think much about it. The plan seemed far enough away from my property to be someone else's concern. Then I received orders for an overseas deployment. Within weeks, I packed my belongings, secured my home, and left. What I didn't know was that shortly after I was gone, the HOA revised its plans. And without asking permission, they decided my land was the perfect place to expand. Only after speaking with a few neighbors did I learn what had really happened while I was overseas. About 2 months after I deployed, construction crews arrived early one Monday morning. Heavy equipment, pallets of concrete blocks, and trucks loaded with landscaping materials filled the entrance to the neighborhood. Most residents assumed the HOA had obtained all the necessary permits. After all, the project looked official, and the board members acted as though everything had been approved. The original plan had called for a decorative entrance wall beside the road. Instead, the wall slowly crept several feet onto my property. One elderly neighbor later told me she questioned the survey stakes because they didn't seem to match the old property markers. The HOA president quickly dismissed her concerns, saying the board had updated the boundary records and that everything had been reviewed by the county. That wasn't true. Even one of the contractors reportedly asked whether a new land survey had been completed before the foundation was poured. According to another worker, the HOA president simply waved a folder in the air and replied, "The paperwork has already been handled. Just keep building." Trusting the client, the crew continued. Within days, the concrete wall was finished. Decorative lights were installed along its base, shrubs and flowers were planted, and a large HOA monument sign was mounted in the center. To anyone driving past, it looked like a permanent part of the neighborhood entrance. By the time I returned from deployment, the project had been completed for weeks. The HOA board believed the wall was now too expensive and too visible to ever be challenged. What they didn't realize was that one neighbor had quietly photographed every stage of the construction, including the original survey markers before they were covered with fresh soil. Those pictures were about to become far more valuable than anyone imagined. The morning after I got home, I didn't call the HOA. I called a licensed land surveyor. Years in the military had taught me one lesson that applied just as well in civilian life: never argue when the facts can do the talking. If the wall truly sat on my property, I wanted proof that no one could dispute. 3 days later, the survey crew arrived with GPS equipment, metal detectors, and copies of the original subdivision plats. They spent hours locating the buried boundary pins, measuring every angle, and comparing the current property lines with the official county records. I watched quietly from my driveway while a few HOA board members stood across the street, whispering among themselves. Linda even walked over and claimed the survey was a waste of time because the board had already confirmed the boundary months earlier. The surveyor didn't respond. He simply kept working. By late afternoon, he handed me a preliminary map. The red line marking my legal property boundary ran directly through the middle of the HOA's newly built wall. Nearly 20 feet of the structure, along with several light posts and landscaped flower beds, had been built entirely on my land. But the biggest surprise came after we visited the county recorder's office. The original deeds, subdivision maps, and easement documents all matched the new survey perfectly. There wasn't a single amendment giving the HOA permission to use my property. In fact, there wasn't even a request on file. Linda hadn't misunderstood the boundary. She had ignored it. Then the surveyor pointed to another line on the map, a narrow access easement that crossed my property. I asked him one simple question. What exactly uses that easement? His answer changed everything. The surveyor traced his finger along the narrow strip marked on the map before looking up at me. This isn't just an easement, he said. It's the only legal access route for the HOA's maintenance vehicles. I leaned closer. The line began near the neighborhood entrance, crossed the corner of my property, and continued behind the decorative wall before connecting to the HOA's utility area. It was the path used by landscaping crews, irrigation contractors, utility technicians, and emergency maintenance vehicles whenever work had to be done inside the common areas. So if this access is blocked? I asked. He shrugged. They'll have a serious problem. Back at the county recorder's office, I requested certified copies of every document related to the subdivision. There was no hidden agreement, no revised plat, and no transfer of ownership. The HOA had every right to use the recorded easement, but only if they respected the surrounding property. Building a permanent concrete wall outside the easement without my permission was a completely different matter. That afternoon, I met with a real estate attorney. After reviewing the survey, photographs, deeds, and the neighbor's construction pictures, he smiled for the first time. They've made a very expensive mistake. I expected him to recommend filing a lawsuit immediately or demanding the wall be demolished. Instead, he shook his head. Don't touch the wall, he said. If you remove it yourself, they'll argue over damages and try to shift the blame onto you. Let the evidence stay exactly where it is. So what do I do? His answer was calm, simple, and perfectly legal. You enforce your property rights. He explained that I could clearly mark my boundary, protect my land, and require everyone, including the HOA, to stay within the recorded easement and nowhere else. Every step had to follow the law, every notice had to be documented, and every conversation had to be in writing. For months, the HOA believed they had boxed me in. They never stopped to consider that by building first and asking questions later, they had quietly boxed themselves into a corner they couldn't legally escape. I followed my attorney's advice to the letter. There would be no angry confrontations, no late-night demolition, and no dramatic revenge. Everything I did would be documented, legal, and impossible to challenge. First, I sent the HOA a formal notice along with a copy of the certified survey. The letter informed the board that the wall, landscaping, and light fixtures had been built on my private property without permission. It also made one thing very clear: from that day forward, no contractor, employee, or HOA representative was allowed to enter my land outside the recorded easement. A week later, after the legal notice period had passed, I hired a fencing company. Using the survey stakes as their guide, they installed a strong steel fence exactly along my property line. Where the recorded maintenance easement crossed my land, I left the required legal access completely open. Everywhere else, the boundary was secured with fencing, locked gates, and clearly visible private property, no trespassing signs. Every measurement was checked twice. Every permit was approved. Every step was photographed. When the project was finished, nothing on my property violated the law. The effects were immediate. The HOA's landscaping crew arrived the following Monday, only to discover they could no longer drive around the illegally built wall the way they always had. The trucks had to stop at the fence, unload equipment by hand, and request permission whenever work extended beyond the easement. Soon, contractors began calling the HOA office, complaining that routine maintenance now took twice as long and cost far more than before. For the first time since the wall had gone up, the board realized something they had never expected. The soldier they thought they had taken advantage of wasn't fighting them with anger. He was fighting them with the law, and he was winning. It didn't take long for the pressure to reach a breaking point. Within 2 weeks, the HOA called an emergency board meeting. Homeowners packed the clubhouse after hearing rumors that the neighborhood could be facing legal action. At first, Linda tried to reassure everyone that the situation was under control and accused me of creating unnecessary problems. That explanation lasted less than 10 minutes. The HOA's attorney stood up and placed the certified survey, county records, and my formal notice on the conference table. "We have a serious liability issue," he said. "The wall was built on private property without the owner's permission. If this goes to court, the association could be responsible for removal costs, property restoration, legal fees, and additional damages." The room fell silent. Several homeowners immediately turned toward Linda. One board member demanded to know who had approved the construction without verifying the property lines. Another asked why no independent survey had been ordered before spending thousands of dollars from the HOA budget. Linda had no answers. A few days later, the county inspector visited the site. After reviewing the documents and comparing them with the official property records, he issued a notice requiring the HOA to correct the encroachment. The contractor who had built the wall admitted he had relied entirely on the HOA's instructions and had never been given a certified boundary survey. With every new document, every inspection, and every legal opinion pointing in the same direction, the board finally understood the truth. They hadn't blocked the wrong piece of land. They had blocked the wrong soldier. Now the only question was how much their mistake was going to cost them. 3 weeks later, the answer arrived. Rather than face a lengthy court battle they were unlikely to win, the HOA's insurance company pushed the board toward a settlement. The agreement was straightforward. The HOA would remove the entire wall at its own expense, restore my property to its original condition, reimburse the cost of the licensed survey, and cover a substantial portion of my legal fees. On the morning demolition began, I stood quietly at the edge of my driveway. The same concrete blocks that had been laid so confidently while I was overseas were now being loaded into dump trucks, one piece at a time. Workers dug up the decorative landscaping, removed the light posts, and carefully uncovered the original boundary markers they had buried months earlier. Linda never came outside. By the end of that week, she had resigned as HOA president, and the neighborhood elected a new board that promised greater transparency and stricter oversight before approving future projects. One of my neighbors walked over and asked if I felt satisfied after everything that had happened. I looked at the freshly restored property line and smiled. "I never wanted revenge," I said. "I just wanted people to respect what wasn't theirs." Sometimes the strongest response isn't shouting, threatening, or getting even. Sometimes it's knowing your rights, standing your ground, and letting the truth do all the work. If they had simply respected my property from the beginning, that wall would still be standing today.